A quiet village, a missing young man, and whispers in the fields, something doesn't add up. Welcome to the mysterious casebook. I am your host, Alexander. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Hearing from you all makes this journey even more special. Now let's begin. The summer fete at St. Mary Mead was an event as reliable as the seasons themselves, a cheerful marker of the year's slow turning. Bunting fluttered from one end of the village green to the other. Children darted about with sticky fingers clutching toffee apples, and the vicar's wife presided over the raffle stall with the air of a benevolent monarch. Cakes, jams, and embroidered linens were proudly displayed, each entry whispering stories of domestic pride and village rivalry. At one end of the green stood a modest stall with rows of amber glass jars, glinting like captured sunlight, shine honey from Beekeeper Owen Maddox's hives. Owen, a stooped man with leathery skin and a perpetual squint, was well liked if a little eccentric, his conversation tending toward the lives and temperaments of bees rather than people. Today, however, it was not Owen who manned the stall but his nephew, Andrew Maddox, who recently returned to St. Mary Mead after years in London. Andrew, a young man of perhaps 27, cut a curious figure among the village folk. Tall and dark-haired, he possessed a restless energy that seemed at odds with the slow rhythms of rural life. His smile was quick, but his sharp, almost watchful eyes betrayed a reserve that puzzled the more garrulous villagers. He had taken up the stall at his uncle's insistence, though he had been heard muttering that bees were far less trying than people. Still, his presence attracted no small amount of attention, especially from the younger ladies of the village, who found his urban manners and slightly aloof charm rather thrilling. Miss Jane Marple, seated beneath a striped parasol with her knitting needles clicking softly, observed the proceedings with her customary air of quiet amusement. To the casual onlooker, she seemed content merely to note the passing of clouds, the bright dresses of the school children, and the occasional wayward dog nosing at picnic baskets. Yet her pale blue eyes missed little. She noticed the sidelong glances Andrew Maddox cast toward the crowd, as if he sought someone or avoided them. She noticed, too, the faint tension about his jaw when Mrs. Price Ridley, with her sharp tongue and sharper eyes, made a passing remark about city boys coming home when they've something to hide. Miss Marple tucked away these observations as neatly as her ball of yarn, saying nothing. As the afternoon wore on, the fete bustled with the usual pleasures and petty dramas. Colonel Melchett bemoaned the state of the cricket pitch, Mrs. Hartnell quarreled over the judging of sponge cakes, and young Tommy Briggs managed to topple the coconut shy stand with more enthusiasm than skill. In short, it was a day like countless others in the village, except for a few moments that, in retrospect, would prove to be anything but ordinary. Near 5 o'clock, as the raffle prizes were announced and the stalls began to close, Andrew Maddox was seen slipping behind the green, carrying a small crate of unsold honey jars. Several witnesses recalled this. Mrs. Clement swore she saw him heading toward the narrow lane behind the churchyard, while Mr. Hargreaves, polishing his spectacles, claimed Andrew had said he was going just to fetch something. Neither saw him return. By the time the fete concluded and villagers drifted homeward with their winnings and gossip, Andrew Maddox had vanished. His absence was not immediately remarked upon. After all, it was easy to imagine a young man escaping early from the obligations of village merriment. It was only later, when Owen Maddox came searching with worry etched deep into his weathered face, that the whispers began. "Not like Andrew," the beekeeper muttered, looking about with anxious eyes. "He promised he'd help me carry things back. He wouldn't just leave without a word." "Perhaps," said Mrs. Price Ridley archly, "he found some company more to his taste than jars of honey. City folk don't take kindly to rustic duty, but others were less dismissive." Mr. Hargreaves, polishing his glasses again, recalled Andrew's strained expression that afternoon. There was something on his mind, I'd wager. He looked as if he had a burden heavier than that crate of jars. The constable was called, though without urgency, for disappearances were rare in St. Mary Mead and most often explained by nothing more sinister than an unexpected visit to a neighboring town. Yet by the next morning, when Andrew had still not returned nor sent word to his uncle, the matter began to take on a darker hue. His room at Owen's cottage lay neat and untouched, his suitcase undisturbed. His absence then was no casual wandering. Miss Marple, sipping her morning tea, listened as her maid, Florence, relayed the talk from the butcher's shop. "They're saying Andrew's gone off suddenly, miss. Some reckon he had debts in London. Others say he was mixed up with the wrong sort. And Mr. Jones at the grocer hinted he saw him arguing with a stranger by the lane yesterday." Indeed. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. It is remarkable how many explanations may be produced in the absence of a single fact. One might almost suppose truth were like honey itself, sweet yet often hidden behind a waxen seal. The first threads of unease wove themselves through the fabric of the village. Where had Andrew Maddox gone? Why had he vanished in the midst of a summer fete, under so many watchful eyes? And, most troubling of all, was his disappearance voluntary, or had darker forces claimed him? For now, only Miss Marple seemed to grasp the gravity beneath the gossip. For she had noticed, at the edge of the fete, small detail others had overlooked. One jar of honey, set apart from the rest, its lid slightly askew as if hastily replaced. A trivial thing, no doubt, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that the smallest of details often carried the weightiest of truths. By breakfast time on Monday, the disappearance of Andrew Maddox had already been kneaded into every loaf of bread and whispered over every cup of tea in St. Mary Mead. The baker's queue hummed with speculation, the sort that swells and shifts like a summer breeze. Some said Andrew had taken the early bus to Market Basing, others that he had been seen at dawn on the footpath by the old lich gate. The story changed subtly with each teller, acquiring new edges and losing old ones, as stories in villages will. Miss Marple, who had never placed much stock in the collective accuracy of rumour, received the news in the same way she received the Morning Post, quietly, with a grave little nod. Florence, bustling in with a tray, brought both a pot of tea and the latest version of events. According to the butcher, who had it from his cousin's wife, who had it from a boy who had been helping at the coconut shy, Andrew had been overheard arguing with a stranger in the lane behind the church. A stranger was always a satisfying touch in a village yarn. It made the world beyond the hedgerows feel at once thrilling and safely distant. "An argument, Florence," Miss Marple repeated, measuring out sugar with delicate care. Voices rise at fate more often than one imagines, and rarely for reasons worth telephoning the police about. "Mr. Jones said he saw it, miss," Florence persisted. "Said the stranger had a bag, one of those city ones, stiff and shiny, not the sort we have." Miss Marple did not dispute this. She had observed over many years that the objects people chose told truer stories than their mouths. A bag, a hat, the way a glove was taken off such things, to her were like little signposts in the fog. By mid-morning, the vicarage was a sort of command post, not because anyone had designated it so, but because Mrs. Clement possessed, in addition to a fine sense of Christian charity, an irresistible urge to organize people for their own good. Volunteers were sorted into small groups to search the lanes and fields. Each was sent off with a thermos and a firm admonition not to trample Farmer Liddle's cabbages. Mr. Hargreaves loaned binoculars with a cracked lens. Young Tommy Briggs, eager to be useful, was redirected from scouring the river with a rake to asking sensibly at the bus stop. Owen Maddox, the beekeeper, stood on the vicarage step like a man who had misplaced not only his nephew but also the rhythm of his days. His hands, habitually steady with hive tools, trembled around a cap he kept twisting. He spoke haltingly of Andrew. Clever, yes, perhaps too quick, sometimes restless, a city habit that did not smooth out easily against the grain of village life. There had been no quarrel at home, No crosswords. Andrew had slept in his room, eaten his breakfast, and helped cart the crates to the fete. The ordinary facts tumbled out, each hardly worth remarking upon, yet together they formed a shape, a life proceeding as usual, until it did not. If he'd gone of his own accord, Owen said, he'd have said something. He may have been close about his affairs, but not unkind. He'd not leave me to worry. Miss Marple laid a hand on his arm, a small feather-light gesture, but steadying. Is there anything missing from his room, Mr. Maddox? A bag, perhaps, or a coat? Nothing, he said. His suitcase is there, his Sunday coat too, his bicycle as well. He took only that small crate of honey round the back of the green, and the clothes he wore. Miss Marple, who disliked to impose yet never hesitated where mercy might be done by it, asked if she might call at Owen's cottage later and sit with him a little. He agreed, grateful, and returned home while the village's makeshift search fanned out like a shawl across the hedgerows. At the grocer's, where Mr. Jones had moved his onion display to make room for those who wished to linger, the argument in the church lane grew more vivid with each telling. The stranger was tall, then short, then medium. He wore tweed, which became a dark coat, then a light one. Only one detail seemed constant, the bag with brass corners, carried in a manner suggesting it was heavier than pride would allow. He had purchased a packet of lozenges and a newspaper, Mr. Jones said, and had the habit of tapping the counter with a coin while he counted his change. Not local? Then St. Mary Mead did not tap counters. Mrs. Price Ridley, a self-appointed arbiter of moral tone, took up her customary perch by the window and announced that Andrew's return from London had always seemed to her suspiciously sudden. She had thought it at the time, she said, and would have said so if anyone had asked, which they had not. When pressed, she could not say precisely what had been suspicious, only that certain kinds of young men were not to be trusted when they carried a smile that did not reach their eyes. It is equally true, Miss Marple observed mildly from a shelf near the tea-tins, that certain kinds of women will place their purses near the edge of the grocer's scale, hoping for a few ounces of advantage. Human nature is very democratic in its failings. There was a little pause, during which Mrs. Price Ridley rearranged her expression into one of charitable forbearance and moved her purse 3 inches away from the scale. Miss Marple left the shop and walked toward the green, her step unhurried. The fate's aftermath still lingered, a crush of flattened grass, a scrap of bunting snagged in a hawthorn, and the chalky outline of the coconut shy's base. Behind the hedge, in the narrow lane by the churchyard. She paused. It was a pleasingly ordinary place, this lane with 2 wheel ruts, a scatter of gravel, and the wall of the church warm with sun. If 2 men had argued here, the stones would not have cared to remember. Yet Miss Marple stooped and touched a patch of dull stickiness near the verge. It came away on her fingertip with the faintest scent of wildflowers. Honey, surely, and very recent. She had already been thinking of the one jar at the stall whose lid had not sat quite true, a thing that would trouble a tidy-minded woman and hardly be noticed by anyone else. Soon after, Andrew had taken a crate behind the green. Why behind? To fetch something, he had said. People often use the convenient word rather than the correct one. Fetch suggested retrieving what had been left, but sometimes people went behind things to put something away unobserved or to exchange one thing for another. She did not pretend to know which it had been, only that the difference mattered. At Owen's cottage, low-roofed, with honeysuckle trying its best to consume a window frame, Miss Marple was received with the clumsy gratitude of a man unused to visitors who come without the requirement of conversation. She set a small parcel of seed cake on the table and asked, as if it were the most natural favor in the world, whether she might look in on the room Andrew was using. Owen, if he thought it odd, did not show it. He led her down the narrow passage and opened a door onto a room neat to the point of impersonality. There was a suitcase under the bed, a jacket hung carefully on a chair, and a book face down on the table, a travel memoir whose author had more opinions than maps. On the windowsill lay a single cufflink of inexpensive metal, the sort young men buy in pairs and then lose. Miss Marple glanced at the small things that made up the absence of a person. No photographs propped against the mirror. No letters on the mantel. It was a traveller's room, even in his uncle's house. "The crates, Mr. Maddox?" she asked gently. "You brought some back after the fete?" "All but one," he said, frowning. "I thought Andrew had taken it behind the green. It was the light crate, with half a dozen jars. I looked for it this morning at the shed, thinking we had left it there by mistake. But no. Andrew helped you seal the jars?" "Yes. New lids this week. He said the gold ones looked old-fashioned. We used the red." He was right. The red is tidy. "Quite," Miss Marple said. "Tidy things do comfort the eye." She did not add that an oddity among tidy things is often like a cracked tile in a hearth, which one notices because the rest is even. On her way back through the village, she was accosted by Ruby at the Blue Boar, who declared with relish that a motor car had been seen on Sunday evening idling near the lane, its paint scratched and its driver is impatient. This was vouched for by Mrs. Hartnell's niece's fiancé, a chain of testimony that would have foundered on any court's rocks, but held well enough in the tavern's dim air. Miss Marple listened with her head slightly to the side, the way Robin listens for worms. She did not accept, nor did she reject. She stored it. Late in the afternoon, the searching parties dribbled back to the vicarage, hot and dusty, telling stories with the relief of those who have done something, even if it is nothing. They had found a child's marble, a hedgehog nest, and a hatpin whose owner was located and scolded into gratitude. But no Andrew. The constable, a conscientious young man whose mustache kept surprising him when he caught sight of it, made a sober note of each small finding and promised to inform the inspector in Much Benham should Andrew not return by evening. "People don't vanish into thin air," Mr. Hargreaves said, a statement that had the air of wisdom and was therefore repeated. Miss Marple agreed people vanish into thick circumstances, which is a very different thing. She had known a footman once who ran away to avoid marrying the girl he had made a promise to, and a matron who disappeared to a brother in Dorset, rather than face the disgrace of a grown son's theft. The reasons were often ordinary, even when the outcomes were not. At sunset, when the swallows were cutting their silent patterns above the chimneys and the village returned to its evening rhythm, Miss Marple sat by her window with a small notebook in which she recorded, not conclusions, but prompts to memory. One jar out of place. A crate is missing. Honey on the lane. A stranger's bag with brass corners. Andrew's room is as tidy as a hotel. None of it proved anything, and yet human beings rarely move without leaving a shape in the air behind them. Even deceivers must choose a manner of deception. She thought of bees, the beekeeper's nephews and uncles, and the queens who hold a hive to its purpose. Bees will sometimes swarm if unsettled, guided by a scent that says home is elsewhere. Men do the same, and for much the same reasons: fear, hope, temptation, and pride. But a man who means to go does not usually leave his map behind and his bicycle at the gate. A man who is taken does not usually pause to set a lid loosely on a jar. Between such differences, a life now hung. Florence came up to announce that the inspector had arrived from Much Benham and was asking questions at the vicarage. A sharp one, they say. He doesn't like nonsense. "Few inspectors do," Miss Marple said, smiling. She rose, folded her knitting, and reached for her shawl. It would not do to seem eager, though a certain briskness crept into her step. She had seen, in the smallest details, the beginning of a pattern. Soon enough, there would be the police's pattern as well, firmer, more linear, inclined toward the obvious suspect. It would be useful to fit the two together and see where the edges refused to meet. She paused at the door, her eyes falling upon a small smear of wax on her window-sill, a souvenir of the seed candle she had trimmed at noon. Honey wax is not like candle wax, she reminded herself. It carries the scent of where it has been. People, too, carry their scents, habits, and histories that cling. She would go to the vicarage, listen very carefully, and if she spoke at all, it would be in the language people found least alarming, that of a gentle old lady making harmless remarks about the weather and the price of jam. Only later, when the pattern became clear, would the harmless remarks arrange themselves into a net. The evening bell tolled once across St. Mary Mead. Behind hedges and curtains, theories jostled and multiplied debt, romance, vengeance, and folly. Miss Marple stepped into the cool of the lane with the air of one who was ready to hear them all and to believe none. The village had reacted, as villages do, with energy and error. Soon would come the part that interested her more, the careful sifting of what people say from what they cannot help but show. The inspector from Much Benham introduced himself at the vicarage as Inspector Caldwell, a compact man with watchful eyes, a soft-spoken manner, and the distinct air of someone who disliked wasting either words or daylight. He shook hands with the vicar, nodded respectfully to Mrs. Clement, and took up position at the end of the long table in the parish room, where a jug of water and a neat stack of foolscap had appeared as if conjured. Beside him, Sergeant Webb, a younger man with an earnest brow and the careful pencil of a trained note-taker, took up his post. "Good evening," Caldwell said, as the small assembly of villagers settled into chairs with the solemnity of a schoolroom. "We'll proceed plainly. This is not a court. I want a clear picture of yesterday's fate and the hours following. If I interrupt, it is because I prefer order to confusion. That is all." The vicar beamed with relief at such sensible parameters. Mrs. Clement approved as well. She considered that, had the inspector gone into housekeeping, he might have excelled. Miss Marple, who had slipped into a chair near a cupboard of hymn books, kept her hands folded and her expression mildly attentive. She noted, as the first few questions began, that Caldwell's gaze drifted not to the speakers' faces, but to their hands. People's hands betray them, he knew. It was a point on which she silently concurred. Caldwell started with Owen Maddox. The beekeeper stood, cap crushed between his fingers, and repeated the facts of the afternoon, the stall of honey, the raffle, and Andrew's kindness in managing the sales, while Owen fetched more jars from the cottage. Near closing time, Andrew took a light crate round the back to fetch something. Those had been his words. He did not return. Owen supposed at first that Andrew had gotten roped into moving tables. Not until later did his worry harden. "You say it was the light crate," Caldwell said. "Half a dozen jars?" "Yes, sir," Owen replied. "The red-lid batch from last week. Any difference between them and the others?" Owen looked puzzled. "Difference, sir." "Flavor," Caldwell said. "Label, marking, anything at all." "Oh," Owen brightened slightly. There was a ribbon on 2 rows. Mrs. Clement had asked for a few to be tied for the fancy stall, then changed her mind. Andrew put those with the rest. It may be those. I couldn't rightly say. He was particular about straightening the labels. "Particular in what way?" Miss Marple asked, very gently, as if she wondered whether labels tended to peel in hot weather. Owen thought, then said, "Andrew disliked any that sat crooked." He smoothed them carefully, pressing along the edge with his thumb. "Thank you," Caldwell said. He motioned Owen to sit and called for Mr. Jones, the grocer. The grocer was a precise witness because precision was his trade. He described the stranger with the brass-cornered bag, his purchase of lozenges and a newspaper, and his coin-tapping habit. He admitted, under Caldwell's calm questioning, that he hadn't noticed the man's shoes or his hat. He did not, after all, sell hats or shoes, but he had noticed the manner of paying coins counted with a lawyerly care, no exchange of pleasantries and a slight impatience for others to move out of the way. "Local?" Caldwell asked. "No, Inspector," Mr. Jones said with authority. He had the manner of a person from somewhere else. Miss Marple, listening, was not as convinced by geography or manners. Some people were from nowhere in particular, which could be the most telling origin of all. Others spoke in turn. Mr. Hargreaves with his spectacles and impressions, young Tommy Briggs with a testimony so enthusiastic that Caldwell had to gently prune it of heroics. Ruby from the Blue Boar supplied the motorcycle paint, perhaps blue, perhaps black, idling near the lane toward evening, the driver impatient, tapping the steering wheel, then leaning out to ask if she remembered very clearly if there was a shorter way toward the old quarry road. She had told him, of course, no such way existed unless one wished to break an axle. "That would be after the fete," Caldwell said. "Just after sunset," Ruby replied. "I'd gone out to shake the tablecloth." Caldwell thanked her. He asked the vicar if the vicar had seen nothing useful, which he confessed with the serene certainty of an honest man who supposes honesty and usefulness frequently coincide. Mrs. Clement supplied a timeline of the raffle that would have done credit to a train schedule, but it provided no foothold. At last, Caldwell closed his notebook. "No one saw Andrew return from the lane," he said. "No one can say which direction he took or whether he met anyone beyond the hedge." He glanced toward the window. "Sergeant, we'll have another look behind the church before full dark." He had a way of looking toward a place before he went there, as if he were willing the ground to give up its reticence. Miss Marple rose when the meeting broke, intending only to slip away quietly. Caldwell intercepted her with a courteous inclination of the head. "Miss Marple, is it?" he said. "I've had it put to me that you possess a sort of, what shall I call it, village scholarship. I should value your impressions." "Impressions are such dangerous things," Inspector Miss Marple returned, smiling. "They have a dreadful penchant for dressing up as conclusions when one isn't looking. But perhaps I may walk a little with you." He accepted, and together with Sergeant Webb trailing a pace behind, they took the path to the churchyard while the last birds scissored the evening sky. The lane behind the hedge presented its familiar unremarkableness. Caldwell surveyed the wheel ruts, the verge, and the stone footings where the hedge began. He crouched, placed 2 fingers lightly upon the gravel, and then pointed with his pencil. "Tire marks, Webb," he said. "Light car. 2 sets in and out, not lingering." "That will be the motor car," our barmaid mentioned. "Do you think the driver met Andrew here, Inspector?" Webb asked. "I think," Caldwell said, "that if he did not intend to be seen." He looked toward the narrow gap in the hedge, where one could, with a careful twist, step into the churchyard unseen from the green. Miss Marple's eye followed him to a small smear on the low wall, dull and amber in the failing light. "May I?" she asked. Caldwell nodded. She touched it with a handkerchief. The faint scent was unmistakable. Honey. Webb made a small exclamation. Caldwell's mouth tightened in satisfaction. Without surprise, he had noted it already and, like a careful man, wished to see whether others would as well. "There was a crate," Miss Marple murmured, "and a jar that looked, how shall I put it, not entirely at ease with its lid." Caldwell gave her a brief look. "You observed that at the stall?" "One notices such things," Miss Marple said placidly. "A jar out of sorts among its well-brought-up fellows." Caldwell gave a short, approving grunt. He straightened and paced the length of the hedge. "No scuffle," he said. "No deep impressions. People imagine violence always leaves the ground dramatic, but it does not any more than a lie leaves a reddened cheek. Webb, take that smear of honey. Bag it. We'll also have a word with any passing motorists last evening. Mrs. Hartnell's nephew keeps a garage. He'll know who bought petrol." They left the lane by the church gate. Caldwell turned not toward the road but toward the wild margin by the lich gate, where nettles grew in an enthusiastic republic. There, half hidden under a loose stone, he found a square of waxed paper, folded twice. He lifted it delicately and opened it. The interior was clean, but a faint ring of stickiness limned the square. "Lid paper," Webb said quickly. "From a jar." "Likely," Caldwell agreed. "Why remove it here, where it can be seen? Why not at home?" Answer: because one needed to do a thing here and then go elsewhere without being observed with the thing. He replaced the paper into a bag, his movements tidy. He did not ask aloud what the thing might be. Miss Marple did not supply an answer because she had none, only images that suggested themselves like shadows behind gauze. She remembered a long-ago case of an under-housemaid who hid, in a teapot, money given to her by a gentleman too friendly for the household's peace. The teapot had seemed too harmless to suspect. Honey, too, had the virtue of respectable innocence. They returned to the vicarage, where Owen waited in a posture of hesitant hopefulness that made Miss Marple's heart turn slightly. Caldwell said, with a gentleness that sat oddly well upon him, that they had found nothing alarming, but that they would continue in the morning with a field-to-field search. "Inspector," Owen said, "if you think he's gone off, if you think it's just well—" "I think very little until I must," Caldwell replied. "And I prefer that the very little be supported by something less fragile than prefabricated gossip." He paused. "Did your nephew have enemies?" "Enemies?" Owen blinked. Oh, Andrew could rub folks the wrong way without meaning to. Quick speech, quicker mind. But enemies, no. He hadn't been back long enough to make any that would count. "Friends?" Caldwell asked. Owen's gaze faltered. He visited the Blue Boar sometimes, spoke to Ruby a time or two, chatted with Mr. Hargreaves about newspapers. "I walked with a lady from the cottage near the footpath, Mrs. Gray, I think. Widow. But friends." He shook his head. "He hasn't settled yet." Mrs. Clement, who knew every occupant of every let cottage within a 2-mile radius, supplied Mrs. Lydia Gray helpfully. She took March Cottage for the summer while her own house in town was being repaired. Very self-possessed. "I'm fond of walking after supper." Caldwell marked the name and, with the economy of a housewife folding a cloth once instead of twice, concluded the evening's formalities. He would interview Mrs. Gray in the morning, he said. He would also speak to the bus conductor, the postmistress, and anyone who had driven the road past the quarry. Absences, he remarked, are sometimes best located by the places they have not been. It was a remark Miss Marple found congenial. On the way out, Caldwell fell into step beside Miss Marple once more. "You said something about a jar not sitting at ease with its lid," he said, not quite looking at her. "What led you to that?" "Only the way the light glanced," Miss Marple said. The metal rim was a trifle shiny compared with the others. Fingers moved, perhaps. And the lid, being the last to be tight, tends to sit higher if closed in haste. "You have sharp eyes," Caldwell said. "Oh, no," Miss Marple corrected gently. "I have a long acquaintance with kitchens." He smiled, rare but genuine. "Very good. Will you do me the favor, Miss Marple, of letting me know if your kitchens remark on anything else?" "If they should, I shall be most happy to share the recipe," she said. That night the village settled again, but less easily than the previous night. Windows darkened earlier. Conversation dropped when footsteps went by, and the wide summer silence was tuned to listening. At the Blue Boar, Ruby polished glasses and told herself sternly not to think of the impatient motorist and the way his thumb had tapped the wheel. At the grocer's, Mr. Jones put his ledger away and frowned at the thought of counter-tapping men whose change is exact but whose presence is not. Mrs. Price Ridley rehearsed what she would say to the inspector if, as she dearly hoped, he were to call and ask for her opinion of the sort of women Andrew ought to have avoided. In her small bedroom, Miss Marple laid aside her shawl and sat for a few minutes at the window. The hedge lay pale and sleepy in the moonlight. Somewhere beyond, hives drowsed under the same soft illumination, their inhabitants snug and purposeful. Bees do not lose themselves, she thought. They are taken by weather, or queen or hunger, but not by indecision. People, alas, are more fragile in their choosing. If Andrew had chosen to go, he had done it strangely. If he had been persuaded to go, the persuasion had likely been of a sort that did not leave finger marks. She thought of Mrs. Lydia Gray, self-possessed walker and widow, of Ruby Sharp-eyed, used to men who want directions they do not deserve, of Mr. Hargreaves, polite, observant, delighted by small authority, of Owen, his hands twisting his cap in circles, as if he could turn back time by making a loop of it, and of the stranger with the brass-cornered bag, as faceless as a pronoun. In the morning, Caldwell would divide his questions with the agreeable thoroughness of a needlewoman sorting threads. Miss Marple would, of course, be there or near there, not obtrusively, merely part of the furniture upon which people set down their careless remarks. For now, she closed the window and drew the curtain. On the vicarage mantel, the clock chimed the hour in a tone that sounded, to the village at large, like reassurance. But in the marrow of St. Mary Mead, something else persisted, not fear exactly, but that pricking sensation that tells you a pattern exists, only your eyes have not quite found the distance at which the shapes resolve. The inspector had begun his work, steady and sensible. The village had begun its own, less reliable, murmuring. Between them, Miss Marple sat with her knitting ready and her ears open for the stitch that had been dropped. It would come, because it always did. The early investigation had cleared away the larger branches. Somewhere among the twigs lay the thing that mattered. Inspector Caldwell began his formal round of questioning early the next morning, moving with the steady discipline of a man who believed in beginning a job before the day had the chance to untidy itself. The sun was bright, the lanes still damp with dew, and already St. Mary Mead thrummed with curiosity disguised as errands. Housewives lingered longer than necessary at their gates. Postmen paused to chat where normally they hurried, and those who had not witnessed anything of consequence suddenly remembered scraps of conversation or gestures that now seemed drenched in significance. The inspector's first visit was to March Cottage, where Mrs. Lydia Gray had taken up residence for the summer. Miss Marple, on the pretext of carrying some knitting wool to Mrs. Clement, happened to be passing the very lane that led to March Cottage and, with a certain innocent slowness, came within earshot of the conversation drifting from the open doorway. It was not intentional, one might say, though Miss Marple had always maintained that one often encountered what was useful if one simply walked at the right pace. Mrs. Gray received Caldwell with an air of calm composure. She was a woman in her mid-30s, attractive in a dignified way, her dark hair swept neatly back, her eyes clear but faintly guarded. She admitted she had spoken with Andrew Maddox on several occasions during her walks. He had been pleasant, even charming, though rather restless in manner. On Sunday, she confessed she had seen him after the fete ended. She had been returning from a stroll when she noticed him at the churchyard lane, speaking to a man she did not recognize. "Can you describe this man?" Caldwell asked. Mrs. Gray hesitated. Not in detail. He was of medium build, wearing a coat too heavy for the weather, and he carried a bag. Andrew appeared agitated, though I could not hear their words. I did not linger. I dislike intruding. "Which direction did they go?" Caldwell pressed. "I believe they walked together toward the quarry road," she said. "I turned homeward. That was the last I saw of him." Miss Marple noted how smoothly the account was given, like a well-practiced line of stitching. Mrs. Gray's voice did not falter, yet her hands, resting on the door-frame, were faintly tense, the knuckles paler than they ought to have been. Miss Marple tucked away the observation without comment, as was her way. Caldwell thanked Mrs. Gray and moved on, but it was enough to set the village buzzing. By the time Miss Marple reached the high street, the news had already preceded her. Andrew had been seen with a mysterious stranger. Lydia Gray had been the one to report it, and as gossip often does, the story shifted its focus to Mrs. Gray. Was she telling the whole truth or protecting someone? At the Blue Boar, Ruby offered her own edition. She remembered Andrew had been there the previous Friday evening, speaking in low tones with a man who might have been the very same stranger. She could not be sure, but the bag sounded familiar. She thought they had argued, though Andrew had laughed in that forced way men do when they are determined not to lose face. Ruby's testimony made the stranger more tangible, less of a rumor and more of a person shaped by shadows and suggestion. Caldwell, however, was not content to let the matter rest on hearsay. By midday, he had summoned Owen Maddox to the vicarage once more. The beekeeper looked more haggard than ever, his cap crumpled in his hands. "Your nephew," Caldwell said, "was seen in company with a stranger. Can you think of any reason why? Did he mention meeting anyone?" Owen shook his head miserably. "No, sir. He kept things to himself, as young folk do, but he wasn't in trouble. Not that way." "Debts?" Caldwell asked pointedly. "No," Owen insisted. "Not that I know of. He was close with money. Too close, maybe. But he'd not borrow where he couldn't pay." Miss Marple, sitting demurely in a corner as though she had been swept in on a tide of church business, spoke in her mild way. "Sometimes, Inspector, people borrow other things than money. They may borrow patience or goodwill or even trust, and those debts can prove the most difficult to settle." The room grew momentarily still. Caldwell inclined his head toward her, acknowledging the remark without endorsing it. Yet it seemed to take root in his mind, for his questions to Owen grew more searching after that, circling not around money but around people Andrew might have quarreled with, however lightly. The first suspect, then, began to emerge not from the stranger, who was too vague a figure to pin down, but from those nearest to Andrew in the village. Suspicion fell in its early stages on Lydia Gray. Why had she seen so much yet chosen to say so little until asked? Why had her account been so neatly phrased? And more troubling still, why had she described Andrew as agitated when others who saw him that afternoon recalled him as merely distracted, perhaps restless, but not visibly distressed? Mrs. Price Ridley, seizing the opportunity, was only too eager to pronounce that widows living alone were never to be entirely trusted. She reminded anyone who would listen that Mrs. Gray's past was unknown, that she dressed too well for someone merely letting a cottage, and that she had the habit of walking in the evening hours when respectable women preferred their knitting. It was not an argument founded not on evidence, but on tone and prejudice, and tone and prejudice, Miss Marple knew, were often the engines that powered early accusations. Meanwhile, Caldwell's sergeant returned from his inquiries at the bus stop and post office. No one had seen Andrew board a bus. The postmistress remembered him collecting a letter the week before, addressed in a woman's hand, but she could not recall the name on the envelope. That small detail fanned the flames of rumor further. Was there a secret correspondent, a woman from his London days? Or was the letter linked somehow to Lydia Gray? By the afternoon, the village had all but decided that Andrew's disappearance was tied to some entanglement of the heart. It was a familiar and satisfying explanation. A young man, a mysterious woman, and a stranger with a budget fitted the kind of tale people had read in novels and half believed of their neighbors. Miss Marple, however, was not persuaded. She sat that evening, in her garden, the scent of roses drifting across the hedge, and thought of how convenient it was for Lydia Gray to describe Andrew walking away with the stranger. Too convenient, perhaps. For if she had wished to be rid of suspicion herself, there could be no tidier way than to place Andrew's last sighting in the company of someone untraceable. She also recalled the honey, a jar with its lid askew, a smear on the wall, a scrap of waxed paper folded behind the Lychgate stone. Such trifles were not the sorts of things a lady like Lydia Gray would notice, yet Miss Marple noticed them all the more keenly for their smallness. People, she reflected, rarely troubled themselves to disguise the trivial, and it was often trivial that truth sat quietly, waiting to be observed. Still, Caldwell pursued his line. The next morning, Mrs. Gray was asked to present herself formally at the vicarage for further questioning. She arrived in a pale blue dress, composed, with an expression that suggested she did not fear scrutiny. Caldwell asked again about the stranger, pressing for more detail. She added only that his accent was not local, and that he seemed impatient, glancing about as though eager to conclude the meeting. When asked whether she had spoken of this sighting to anyone before the inspector's arrival, she said calmly, "No. It was not my affair to tell tales." It was a sensible answer, yet it hardened some opinions against her. In villages, silence could be as incriminating as a shout. When the meeting adjourned, Caldwell found himself none the wiser, but with the beginning of a framework. Andrew Maddox had disappeared after being seen with a stranger. Mrs. Gray confirmed the encounter. Ruby had hinted at an earlier meeting with perhaps the same man. Beyond that, there was nothing solid. But the inspector, like the villagers, was inclined to rest suspicion where it was easiest to lay. And Lydia Gray, a mysterious widow, solitary in her rented cottage, became in those hours the village's first suspect. Miss Marple, however, continued her knitting with unruffled patience, for she knew well that the first suspect was almost always the wrong one. Life, like knitting, tangled threads far more cleverly than that. The pattern, she felt sure, would reveal itself only when the other colors were added, the other motives teased into view. Until then, she would wait, her needles clicking softly, listening more to what people failed to say than to the words they spoke. Inspector Caldwell, though level-headed and pragmatic, was not blind to the power of village speculation. By the third day of Andrew Maddox's disappearance, he understood that too much energy had already been spent whispering about Mrs. Lydia Gray. He disliked seeing an investigation take its course from gossip rather than from the ground beneath his own feet. Yet, as is so often the case in such matters, the rumor of guilt clung more stubbornly than the certainty of fact. Miss Marple, meanwhile, continued to observe quietly. She had seen this pattern many times before. An early suspect presented, the collective sigh of relief from a community eager to name a villain, and then the inevitable hardening of blind alleys. The truth, she knew, usually lurked in a far less dramatic corner. On the morning following Mrs. Gray's second questioning, Miss Marple paid Owen Maddox a visit at his cottage, carrying a small basket of scones. Owen looked worn to a thread, his eyes hollow from sleeplessness, his hands rougher than usual from restless work about the hives. The bees, he said, gave him little comfort now. They carried on with their ordered purpose, while his household remained disordered. "I've turned over every board in the shed," he confessed, "every corner of the garden. There's nothing of Andrew's missing except that crate. It's as though the earth swallowed him whole." Miss Marple seated herself in a wooden chair and listened as he rambled on. She asked now and then the sort of questions that sounded like idle chatter but were anything but. Had Andrew been in the habit of keeping anything private? Did he take long walks alone? Did he receive letters? Owen admitted to seeing 1 or 2 envelopes in his nephew's pocket but never asked after them. "A man has a right to his own correspondence," he said defensively. While Owen fussed over the kettle, Miss Marple's eyes rested on the table by the window. There, among a jumble of hive tools, lay a narrow strip of paper. She picked it up delicately. It was the corner torn from a honey gold label with the red border Owen had spoken of. The edges were sticky, as though it had been pulled hastily from a jar. "Oh," Owen said when he saw it in her hand. "That must have come loose when we packed the crate. Funny, I didn't notice." Miss Marple smiled gently and set it down again. "Things that come loose often have a way of wandering further than one expects," she murmured. To Owen, the scrap was nothing to her. It was a reminder that small, misplaced things can sometimes map the movement of larger, hidden ones. Later that day, Inspector Caldwell called a small gathering at the vicarage. He laid out what he knew with his usual sober clarity. No sign of Andrew had been found on the roads or fields. No bus conductor had seen him. No inn had recorded a guest of his description. The motor car reported by Ruby had not been identified, though inquiries at nearby garages continued. The one consistent feature across testimonies remained the stranger with the brass-cornered bag. And yet, Caldwell observed, not a single person besides Lydia Gray could positively place that man in Andrew's company at the crucial moment. Sergeant Webb then produced the scrap of waxed paper found behind the lich gate. Caldwell explained it to the room as if speaking to a jury. This paper was removed from a honey jar. We cannot say which one nor why it was discarded there, but it suggests that a jar was opened and opened in haste. He did not add what Miss Marple silently supplied to herself, that opening a jar in such a manner suggested it was not the honey that interested someone, but what lay concealed within. The villagers muttered among themselves. To them, the paper was too minor a detail to build upon, but Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she thought. She recalled the single jar at the fete, lid set askew. She recalled the honey smear on the church wall and the torn label on Owen's table. A trifling pattern, perhaps, but one she could not dismiss. Caldwell continued with questions for Mrs. Clement about the raffle prizes. Had Andrew won or purchased anything besides the honey stall duties? Mrs. Clement, ever precise, confirmed he had not. But then she paused, frowning slightly, and remembered that one small jar of honey had been placed in the charity basket along with jams. When she unpacked the basket later, the jar was gone. Perhaps it had been removed, perhaps it had broken. She could not be sure. "Who handled the basket?" Caldwell asked. "Andrew carried it to my table," she replied. "I do recall that now. He said he would fetch something else and left. That may have been when she stopped, eyes widening at the possible implication." The room buzzed again. Caldwell raised a hand to steal them. "Until we find Andrew, speculation serves no one, but we must follow every thread." Miss Marple sat quietly, her expression unchanged. Yet inwardly she saw the threads beginning to twist together, a jar with its lid disturbed, a missing jar from a basket, paper discarded in the lane, and honey smeared where Andrew was last seen. Not proof, not yet, but the suggestion of concealment. And concealment, in her long experience, was never random. That evening, as twilight settled and lamps were lit across the village, Miss Marple strolled past the Blue Boar. Ruby beckoned her in with the eagerness of someone who had more to tell. Ruby confessed she had remembered something else on Friday, when Andrew had been in conversation with the stranger. She had seen the stranger tap the edge of a honey jar before sliding it back across the counter. It had struck her as odd at the time, though she had thought nothing of it. Miss Marple listened intently. "A jar of honey, you say?" "Yes," Ruby insisted. He picked it up, tapped it once, like he was weighing it, then set it back. Andrew laughed, but not in a way that was merry. Miss Marple thanked her with a smile. A picture was forming, faint as yet, but discernible to eyes accustomed to such puzzles. Honey jars, it seemed, were at the heart of the matter, and honey jars, to most, were as harmless as teapots. Yet Miss Marple knew well that the most innocent vessels often contained the most inconvenient truth. She walked home slowly, her mind at work. Bees stored honey with tireless devotion, each drop sealed and kept until needed. Men, too, stored secrets, though not always so neatly. She had no doubt now that Andrew's disappearance was tangled with one of those jars and that something hidden had drawn him to the church lane. By the time she reached her gate, she knew also that suspicion of Mrs. Gray, though convenient, was too blunt an answer. Lydia had seen Andrew, yes, but whether she told all she knew was another matter. Far more interesting to Miss Marple's eye was the stranger's choice to test a jar of honey. What did he expect to find within? Or rather, what had someone placed there, trusting the sweetness of honey to disguise it? It was not yet the moment for conclusions, But as she set her knitting on her lap and listened to the distant hum of Owen's hives, Miss Marple felt sure that the bees would yet lead her to the truth. For among the jars of honey, as surely as in the tangled vines of village gossip, lay the hidden clue that explained why Andrew Maddox had vanished. By the fourth day, the pleasant air of summer in St. Mary Mead had grown heavy, almost oppressive, not with weather but with suspicion. Windows opened less freely, conversations were cut short when strangers passed, and at the post office, letters were scrutinized with an eagerness that bordered on zeal. The missing Andrew Maddox was no longer just a nephew or a beekeeper's assistant. He had become the axis around which every whispered theory turned. Inspector Caldwell moved with greater urgency now. He had ordered the fields and lanes searched again, more thoroughly, and the quarry road inspected. Yet nothing tangible emerged. The motor car with the scratched paint remained elusive. The stranger with the brass-cornered bag dissolved like mist whenever Caldwell tried to pin down a definite description. Faced with the absence of clarity, the inspector turned his attention back to the people of the village, their movements, their relations, and their carefully guarded pasts. It was on Thursday morning that the first real confrontation took place. Caldwell summoned Lydia Gray once more, this time to the parish room where Owen Maddox was also present. The widow entered with her usual composure, but her lips tightened when she saw Owen seated at the table, his face creased with grief and suspicion. "Mrs. Gray," Caldwell began, "you've told us you saw Andrew speaking with a stranger near the churchyard on Sunday evening. Mr. Maddox here believes his nephew would not have left without some word. Do you stand by your statement?" "Of course," Lydia replied, her voice calm though her cheeks flushed slightly. "I saw what I saw. I had no reason to invent it." "You also said Andrew appeared agitated," Caldwell pressed. "Would you describe it more plainly? Was he angry, fearful, or eager?" Lydia hesitated. "Nervous, I would say, as though he wanted to conclude the conversation quickly." At this, Owen sprang to his feet. "That's not true. Andrew wasn't the sort to skulk about like a thief. You're making him out to be." He broke off, his voice trembling. Lydia's eyes hardened. "I did not say he was dishonest, Mr. Maddox, only that he seemed unsettled." Miss Marple, who sat quietly in the corner with her knitting basket, observed the exchange with interest. Anger is often revealed as much as words. Owen's vehemence was not only grief, there was a sting of something else beneath it, perhaps guilt at not knowing his nephew more fully. Lydia, on the other hand, defended herself with poise, but Miss Marple noted how quickly she had shifted the focus from what she had seen to how she herself might be judged. It was the reflex of someone accustomed to scrutiny. Caldwell raised a hand for quiet. "Enough. No one is accused, but I must understand why your accounts differ so much. Mr. Maddox insists Andrew had no cause to be agitated. You say otherwise. Until Andrew is found, I cannot disregard either of you." The confrontation left both Lydia and Owen stiff and silent, each unwilling to look at the other. The meeting concluded with no resolution, but the air in the parish room carried the unmistakable tang of hidden tensions. That afternoon, new whispers reached Miss Marple. Ruby from the Blue Boar confided to a friend, who naturally confided to another, that Andrew had not always been as upright as he appeared. On several evenings, he had been overheard discussing arrangements with someone in hushed tones, his voice carrying only the words "delivery" and "package." Some thought he might have been running errands for London acquaintances. Others darkly suggested smuggling or black market dealings. Ruby herself was less certain, but her memory of Andrew's Friday night argument with the stranger was becoming more detailed with each retelling. Miss Marple, hearing this second-hand, reflected that truth in a village often arrived like embroidery. One began with a small patch, and by the time the story had passed through several pairs of hands, it was covered in ornate stitching that bore only a distant resemblance to the original fabric. Still, Ruby's remark about delivery pricked her attention. It fitted too neatly with the honey jars and their unexplained disturbance. Later that day, Inspector Caldwell interviewed Mr. Hargreaves, who lived in rooms above the tobacconist's. The bespectacled clerk admitted that Andrew had come to see him more than once, bringing newspapers from London. At first, Hargreaves had thought it a kindness, but then he realized Andrew often asked him to keep the papers until later, collecting them discreetly. He didn't want Owen to see, I think, Hargreaves added, lowering his voice. There were advertisements marked in them, for jobs, perhaps, or meetings. I couldn't say. The revelation unsettled Owen when it reached him. He had believed Andrew meant to stay in St. Mary Mead, perhaps even take on the hives more permanently. To hear otherwise was a blow. "Why wouldn't he tell me?" he murmured, staring at the ground. "Why keep it from me if he was planning to leave?" Miss Marple, who stood nearby, answered softly, "Because people are often kinder in silence than in honesty. A young man does not always wish to wound his elder with his ambitions." She recalled many such instances, from sons of gardeners to clerks' apprentices, who concealed their restlessness until they were already gone. As the days passed, other secrets surfaced. Mrs. Price Ridley claimed to have seen Andrew and Lydia Gray walking together on one occasion, though whether they spoke intimately or merely exchanged pleasantries was uncertain. Mrs. Clement remembered Andrew excusing himself sharply during a churchyard conversation when someone mentioned London debts, though she could not say who had brought it up. And young Tommy Briggs, eager to be useful, declared he had once seen Andrew hide something in the hollow of a tree near the cricket field. When pressed, he admitted it might only have been a cigarette tin. Inspector Caldwell sifted these accounts with patience, but Miss Marple noticed the strain about his eyes. A missing man could be explained as a tangle of motives that was far less straightforward. Each new detail seemed to widen the field rather than narrow it. It was in the midst of this confusion that Miss Marple encountered Lydia Gray on the lane one evening. The widow walked briskly, her head held high, but slowed when she saw Miss Marple approaching with her knitting bag. "Good evening, Mrs. Gray," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Such fine weather for a stroll." "Yes," Lydia replied, though her tone lacked warmth. She hesitated, then added, "I suppose everyone believes I know more than I've said." "People do love to believe things," Miss Marple said mildly. "It saves them the trouble of discovering them." Lydia gave a small, bitter laugh. "I have nothing to hide, Miss Marple. My husband died 2 years ago. I left my house while it was being repaired. I prefer to walk in the evenings." "None of that is crime." "Not at all," Miss Marple agreed. "It is only that the village has grown restless. A disappearance is like a stone dropped into a pond. The ripples reach everyone, whether they stand near the stone or not." For a moment, Lydia's eyes softened. Then she drew her shawl tighter and said, "I hope they find Andrew soon. Whatever the truth is, it has already done its damage." She walked on, leaving Miss Marple with the impression of a woman both defensive and weary, as though the burden of suspicion weighed heavier than any secret she might actually hold. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple considered the day's revelations. Andrew had corresponded secretly, handled newspapers discreetly, and spoken in half-concealed tones of deliveries and packages. Honey jars had been tampered with, and one had vanished altogether. Lydia Gray's testimony still left questions, but she did not ring as false as others claimed. Owen Maddox's grief carried its own shadows, perhaps of ignorance rather than guilt, and through it all, the image of the stranger with the brass-cornered bag loomed, faceless but central. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as the evening deepened. Confrontations had stirred emotions, and secrets were beginning to surface. Yet she knew these were only the outer petals of the bloom. The heart of the flower, the concealed core, remained untouched. It would reveal itself, as it always did, through some overlooked trifle, perhaps a scrap of paper, a mislaid label, or a remark tossed aside as unimportant. She would wait for it, watching as patiently as a bee upon its flower, until the truth emerged. Friday dawned with a restless wind that tugged at the hedges and rattled the window panes of St. Mary Mead. The weather seemed to echo the village mood, unsettled, uneasy, and expectant of something unpleasant. 4 days had passed since Andrew Maddox vanished, and already the villagers' curiosity had hardened into a kind of anxious impatience. People wanted a resolution, whether it came in the form of discovery, confession, or tragedy. Few could bear the weight of a mystery stretched out over so many breakfasts, teas, and suppers. Inspector Caldwell sensed this shift keenly. His own investigation had thus far produced more shadows than substance. Mrs. Lydia Gray remained the convenient suspect in the village's imagination, but Caldwell disliked how little evidence supported or refuted her story. Owen Maddox's grief seemed sincere, yet sincerity could exist even in those who carried guilt of a different kind. The stranger with the brass-cornered bag remained maddeningly elusive, and the honey jars, those humble golden vessels, hovered at the edges of every theory like silent witnesses. It was near mid-morning when the twist came. A farmhand from the edge of Much Benham cycled breathlessly into the village with news. He had been tending a boundary hedge when he noticed something odd, half hidden in a ditch that ran along the old quarry road. Curious, he had scrambled down and uncovered a small wooden crate. Inside were 3 jars of honey, their lids tight, their labels smudged with earth. He had brought the crate at once to the constable's station, uncertain of its meaning but certain of its importance. The discovery spread through the village in minutes. The lost crate, the very one Andrew had been carrying behind the fete, had been found, or at least part of it, for Owen Maddox insisted there had been 6 jars, not 3. The remaining 3 were nowhere to be seen. Inspector Caldwell wasted no time. The crate and jars were brought to the vicarage, where he examined them carefully. The wood of the crate was damp and splintered, suggesting it had lain exposed for several days. The labels were indeed from Owen's red lid batch, though one jar bore a lid that seemed faintly newer than the others. He tapped it, listening, then unscrewed it with slow deliberation. A faint scent of honey wafted up, but also, beneath it, something acrid and unfamiliar. The jar was empty, its sticky interior scraped almost clean. The villagers who had crowded into the room murmured in astonishment. A honey jar without honey seemed an affront to natural order, like a teapot without tea or a clock without hands. Caldwell's eyes, however, sharpened. He examined the lid more closely. There were faint scratches along the inside rim, as though it had been pried open with an object not meant for the purpose. "Mr. Maddox," he said to Owen, "do you ever use your jars for anything other than honey?" "Never," Owen replied with firm bewilderment. "What else would they be for?" Caldwell grunted. "Then someone else has." The revelation rippled outward. If Andrew had carried a crate of jars, and some were later found emptied or missing, then whatever had been hidden inside those jars could explain his disappearance. Money, letters, and jewels. It was the stuff of speculation, and speculation bloomed at once in every corner of the village. Miss Marple, standing quietly near the window, did not join in the chatter. She gazed at the jars with thoughtful interest. It was not the idea of what might have been concealed that occupied her mind, but rather the thought of why honey had been chosen at all. Honey was heavy, sticky, and troublesome to tamper with. Yet it carried the advantage of appearing too innocent to question. Few would trouble themselves to look beyond sweetness. That, she thought, was the very reason it had been chosen. As Caldwell prepared to have the jars sent for further examination, Sergeant Webb hurried in with more news. A bundle of letters had been discovered near the same ditch, scattered and damp but still legible. They were addressed to Andrew Maddox, care of Owen Maddox, St. Mary Mead. Most were dull enough circulars and advertisements, but 2 were different. written in the same neat female hand. They bore no return address. The inspector read them swiftly, then folded them away without sharing their content, but his expression had grown graver. That afternoon, the inspector called Lydia Gray once more. This time he questioned her about correspondence. Has she ever written to Andrew Maddox? She denied it firmly, her composure intact, though her voice carried an edge of irritation. I had no reason to write to him, she said. Why should I? We exchanged pleasantries when we met. That was all. Owen, who was present, looked bewildered. Andrew never spoke of letters. He wasn't the sort to tell me everything, but letters from a lady. He'd have said something. Miss Marple, who had been allowed to sit quietly in the background, as was her habit, noticed that Lydia's denial was quick, too quick perhaps, like a door slammed before one sees inside the room. Yet whether she lied to conceal guilt or simply to protect her dignity remained uncertain. Miss Marple did not allow herself to decide too soon. She had learned that truth often wore borrowed clothes until the proper time came to change them. By evening, the village buzzed anew. The crate, the jars, and the letters all gave fresh fuel to the fire. At the Blue Boar, speculation grew almost giddy. Some were sure Andrew had been involved in smuggling valuables from London, hidden in jars of honey to escape detection. Others swore the letters hinted at a love affair gone wrong. A few whispered of espionage, recalling wartime tales of codes concealed in jam labels and secret messages baked into loaves of bread. In a village accustomed to simple thefts of poultry and disputes over fences, such theories were thrilling. Yet beneath the excitement ran unease. If Andrew had been mixed up in something larger, then his disappearance was no mere youthful escapade. It suggested danger. It suggested, too, that others in the village might be entangled, knowingly or unknowingly. Miss Marple, sitting that night with her knitting, reflected on the twist. The recovered crate had shifted the pattern, but it had not clarified it. If anything, the picture grew murkier. Someone had opened a jar in haste and discarded its paper. Someone had scattered letters, perhaps deliberately, perhaps not. And 3 jars still remained unaccounted for. The missing pieces of the puzzle were often the ones that mattered most. She thought of the stranger tapping the jar at the Blue Boar. She thought of Andrew's restless eyes at the fate. She thought, too, of Lydia Gray's poised denial and of Owen's grief-stricken insistence that his nephew would not have gone willingly. All these threads seemed separate, yet she sensed they wove together beneath the surface. The twist of the crate was not the end of the story. It was the signal that the story had entered its darker middle. Outside, the wind moaned against the hedges, and the bees in Owen's hives huddled together against the night. Bees, Miss Marple thought, never lost sight of their queen, never left their hive without purpose. People, however, were quite another matter, and Andrew Maddox, wherever he was, had been caught in a web not spun by nature, but by human hands. The recovered jars were a clue, yes, but also a warning someone had gone to great lengths to hide something within the honey, and such lengths were not taken lightly. The village of St. Mary Mead, so quiet on the surface, had revealed another layer of secrets. And Miss Marple, with her gentle eyes and patient mind, knew that more secrets would soon come crawling into the light. Saturday morning arrived with a deceptive brightness, as though the sunshine hoped to persuade the villagers that all was once more well in St. Mary Mead. But beneath the golden air there lingered a taut unease. The discovery of the honey crate had stirred the village like a stick through a pond. What had seemed a stagnant mystery now rippled outward in ever-widening circles. Speculation had grown wilder, suspicion sharper. Neighbors measured each other with new wariness, as though anyone might have hidden a secret in a honey jar. Inspector Caldwell, though steady as ever, allowed himself one admission to Sergeant Webb. "We are not chasing a disappearance alone, Webb. We are chasing what was placed in those jars." It was as close as he came to frustration. The inspector had the sort of patience that wears well in an investigation, but even he could not ignore the gnawing truth that Andrew Maddox had been drawn into something larger than a village fete. Miss Marple, for her part, did not waste her morning in speculation. She had already reached the quiet conviction that the honey was the true center of the matter, not the fate, nor even Andrew's restless ambitions. And so, with her knitting bag upon her arm and her hat tied neatly beneath her chin, she set about her own method, not confrontation in the inspector's style, but small conversations, unobtrusive observations, and the careful dropping of remarks that drew out more than they seemed to. Her first call was upon Mr. Hargreaves, the bespectacled clerk who had kept Andrew's newspapers. He greeted her with nervous courtesy, as though expecting reproach for his habit of hoarding other people's circulars. Miss Marple only smiled. She spoke of trifles of the weather and of the roses in her garden, and then, as if by chance, asked whether Andrew had ever been particular about the jars of honey he sold. Particular? Hargreaves adjusted his spectacles. Well, yes. I recall one day he seemed almost cross when I picked one at random. He exchanged it for another, saying that one was spoken for. Odd, really. They all looked the same to me. Miss Marple inclined her head. Things that look the same are sometimes not so, Mr. Hargreaves. People, too. She left him with that thought, knowing it would preoccupy him long after she was gone. Her next stop was at the Blue Boar. Ruby, polishing glasses in the empty morning hours, was eager for an audience. She told Miss Marple yet again of Andrew's conversation with the stranger, adding the fresh detail that he had tapped, not one jar, but two before settling on one. Like he knew what he was looking for, Ruby concluded, her eyes wide. But Andrew didn't want me to listen. He turned it into a joke. Miss Marple listened patiently. And the stranger, Ruby, did he seem familiar in any way? Ruby frowned, then shook her head. Not to me. But he wasn't clumsy like a farm man. He had city polish, if you understand me. I do indeed, Miss Marple said softly. City polish can often hide roughness beneath. Very like beeswax polish on an old tablet shines, but the cracks remain. By midday, Inspector Caldwell had learned of her little visits and came himself to Miss Marple's cottage. He found her seated by the window, her needles clicking calmly. He expressed mild exasperation, though tinged with respect, that she seemed always one step ahead of where he intended to go. She smiled, as though amused by the very idea of competition. I wonder, Inspector, she said, if you might indulge an old lady in a thought experiment. Suppose one wished to conceal something small, papers, perhaps, or a trinket of value. One might wrap it in cloth or bury it in earth. But then, such places invite searching. A honey jar, however, is heavy, sticky, and ordinary. One can pass it to anyone and it excites no suspicion. Caldwell admitted the logic. But why honey jars from Mr. Maddox's hives specifically? Because they are plentiful and innocent, Miss Marple replied. No one would question a beekeeper's jars at a village fete. And if one or two went astray, well, who would count them? The inspector regarded her with keen eyes. You believe Andrew knew of this concealment? I believe, Miss Marple said, choosing her words with care, that he stumbled into something larger than himself. Whether he was willing or unwilling, I cannot yet say, but one thing is certain, his disappearance was no accident of whim. He was removed, or persuaded to remove himself, for the sake of what those jars contained. Caldwell tapped his notebook thoughtfully. And who, in your estimation, had reason to do such a thing? Miss Marple gave him a mild look. That, Inspector, is the wrong question. The proper question is who behaved differently than usual, in ways small enough to seem unimportant. For it is in those small shifts that people betray themselves. The inspector left somewhat chastened, but also intrigued. He had learned not to discount the observations of the quiet old lady, though he would never admit aloud how often her gentle musings reframed his own inquiries. That evening brought the day's most unsettling turn. A boy delivering milk near the quarry road spotted something caught in a thorn bush, a torn scrap of fabric. It proved to be part of a jacket sleeve, dark wool, with a button still attached. Owen Maddox recognized it instantly as belonging to Andrew. The fabric was damp and stained, as though it had been dragged through mud. The discovery cast a new pall over the village. This was no longer the mystery of a young man who might have chosen to leave. It was now the suggestion of violence. If Andrew's jacket had been torn, where was the rest of it? Where was Andrew himself? Inspector Caldwell ordered a careful search of the area once more. Men with lanterns combed the hedgerows, but nothing further emerged. Only the scrap of fabric, mute and stubborn, spoke of struggle. The villagers reacted with renewed fervor. Mrs. Price Ridley declared it proof that Lydia Gray had lied all along. How else could she have known Andrew walked with a stranger if she herself had not been involved? Others whispered darker possibilities, that Owen had quarreled with his nephew over debts or duties, that the beekeeper had discovered secrets too late. At the Blue Boar, some spoke of smugglers, others of spies. Theories multiplied like bees swarming from a disturbed hive. Miss Marple, however, remained serenely calm. She examined the fabric herself, noting not only the tear but also the faintest trace of something crystalline clinging to the wool. Sugar, perhaps, or dried honey. The jacket had been close to the jars. She was sure of it. And the placement in a thorn bush struck her as deliberate, not accidental, as though someone wished the jacket to be found. A breadcrumb, but dropped with purpose. That night, in her quiet sitting room, Miss Marple reflected on the matter. The crate had been discovered. The letters had been found. Now a scrap of clothing has surfaced. Each clue arrived like a staged act in a play, timed to appear just when interest might falter. That, to her, was the truest indication of deception. Real mysteries often revealed themselves in messy, uneven bursts, but staged mysteries designed by human hands unfolded with the careful rhythm of someone tugging at a curtain. She resolved then to begin her final test. Not to accuse, not yet, but to draw out the guilty hand by placing it near temptation. People, she knew, betrayed themselves most surely when they believed no one was watching, and what better disguise than that of a harmless old lady with her knitting? The following morning, Miss Marple would pay visits once more. She would drop certain remarks, offer small observations, and note the reactions. For somewhere among Lydia Gray, Owen Maddox, Ruby, and the wider circle of villagers, someone was reacting too sharply, too quickly, or not at all when they ought to. The bees in Owen's hives worked tirelessly in the moonlight, as they always did, sealing their honey with wax, concealing sweetness beneath order. And Miss Marple, sitting alone with her needles, knew she was about to do the same to seal her suspicions in silence until the moment came to lift the lid. Sunday dawned pale and unsettled, with clouds drifting low over the church spire, as though the very heavens leaned closer to observe the drama unfolding in St. Mary Mead. The bells rang out as usual, summoning villagers to service, yet the congregation assembled with more than hymns in their hearts. Each pew seemed crowded not only with worshippers, but also with whispered theories. Andrew Maddox's disappearance had ceased to be merely an unfortunate mystery. It had become the very pulse of the village, quickening with every new rumor. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the back, observed the congregation with her usual unobtrusive care. Lydia Gray sat upright, composed, though her lips scarcely moved during the hymns. Owen Maddox looked gaunt and worn, as though the weight of each tolling bell pressed harder upon him. Ruby from the Blue Boar whispered to a neighbor until silenced by Mrs. Clement's firm glance. Even Inspector Caldwell attended, his eyes sharp beneath his bowed head, listening less to the vicar's sermon than to the small movements of the flock around him. The village was no longer at peace. It was a disturbed hive, buzzing with agitation. After the service, Caldwell drew Owen aside for a private word, though half the congregation lingered within earshot under the pretense of admiring the flower arrangements. Caldwell asked Owen once more whether Andrew had ever hinted at acquaintances beyond the village. Owen, weary but resolute, insisted no. Andrew had spoken of London little, and when he did, it was always with a note of dismissal. He wanted to forget it, Owen said. Whatever he left behind there, he wanted none of it here. Yet the inspector noted the tremor in his voice. Wanting to forget is not always the same as managing to forget. Miss Marple, meanwhile, drifted among the departing villagers, dropping her small, seemingly harmless remarks. To Ruby, she mentioned the recovered crate. Ruby's eyes widened with curiosity, but her tone was dismissive, as though she knew more than she wished to confess. To Mrs. Price, Ridley observed that Lydia Gray seemed particularly dignified under suspicion. Mrs. Price Ridley seized the bait at once, declaring that such composure was precisely what made Lydia dangerous. Miss Marple nodded politely, her mind quietly noting the eagerness of the judgment rather than its content. Eagerness, after all, often reveals more than caution. The real test came later that afternoon. Miss Marple invited a small group for tea in her garden. Owen Maddox, Lydia Gray, Ruby, and Mr. Hargreaves. To the untrained eye, it seemed merely the gesture of a kind old lady hoping to ease frayed nerves. But Miss Marple had arranged the gathering with purpose. She knew that in the press of ordinary conversation, when tempers rubbed against one another like stones in a brook, something useful might be revealed. The gathering began politely enough. Miss Marple served seed cake, commenting on the weather, while Ruby gossiped about visitors at the Blue Boar. Owen spoke little, his eyes shadowed. Lydia Gray maintained her poise, answering questions with just enough civility to avoid rudeness. Mr. Hargreaves, ever eager to supply detail, rambled on about newspapers and the oddities of London advertisements. It was then that Miss Marple produced, quite casually, the torn strip of label she had once found on Owen's table. She held it between her fingers as though it were a scrap of nothing, saying in her gentle way, "It is strange, is it not, how these little bits of paper travel? I sometimes find them tucked in the most unlikely corners." The effect was immediate. Owen blinked at it with confusion, muttering something about crates. Ruby leaned forward, eyes sharp with curiosity, but it was Lydia whose reaction caught Miss Marple's eye. For the briefest moment her hand trembled on her teacup, the faintest clink betraying her. She recovered quickly, too quickly, and remarked that labels were always coming unstuck. But Miss Marple had already seen what she needed, the reflex of recognition swiftly masked. Encouraged, Miss Marple continued with her small experiment. She mentioned, in the mildest tone, that some jars from the recovered crate had been opened and emptied. "I suppose," she said, "that one might even hide a letter in such a jar without anyone noticing, unless, of course, one was searching for honey instead of secrets." Mr. Hargreaves gave a nervous laugh. Ruby's eyes gleamed with excitement. Owen only looked bewildered, shaking his head at the thought of his honest honey put to such dishonest use. But Lydia Gray grew very still, her gaze fixed on the crumbs of seed cake upon her plate. It was not guilt written upon her face, not clearly, but it was fear. Fear, Miss Marple thought, of being drawn further into something she had tried to step away from. After the tea, Inspector Caldwell arrived to consult privately with Miss Marple. Though he never openly confessed reliance upon her, his visits to her cottage had become frequent. He reported that the letters found near the ditch contained phrases that suggested arrangement times, places, and vague references to delivery. They were unsigned but unmistakably personal. Caldwell was not prepared to accuse Lydia, but he admitted her denials rang hollow. Miss Marple listened, then asked in her soft way, "Inspector, do you not find it curious that evidence appears when we most grow restless? The crate, the letters, and the scrap of fabric arrive like actors entering a stage at just the right cue." Caldwell frowned, acknowledging the truth of it. "You believe someone is planting these things to mislead us?" "I believe," Miss Marple replied, "that someone is very carefully arranging what we find, and when things are arranged, they are meant to be seen in a certain way. The question is, who benefits from us looking in that direction?" That evening, as the village darkened into quiet, Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting needles clicking with steady rhythm. She reflected on what she had observed. Lydia Gray's trembling hand, Ruby's hungry eyes, Owen's bewildered grief, and Hargreaves's nervous chatter were each a thread in the tapestry. None alone proved guilt, but together they began to form the faint outline of a pattern. The net was tightening, though not in the way most villagers believed. They thought Lydia Gray, the prime suspect, suspected Miss Marple was entangled, yes, but not the spider at the center of the web. Someone else had orchestrated the placement of the crate, the scattering of the letters, and the discovery of the torn fabric. Someone with a keen sense of timing and a sharp understanding of how easily suspicion can be guided. As she laid aside her knitting for the night, Miss Marple allowed herself the faintest smile. The pattern was emerging. It was not yet clear enough to declare, but soon it would be. And when the moment came, she would know precisely how to test the person behind it. For the guilty, she had always found, revealing themselves most surely not under accusation, but under the illusion that they are safe. That would be her task in the days to come. To let the guilty believe themselves secure until their own actions betrayed them. By Monday morning, the air of St. Mary Mead had grown thick with speculation. The discovery of Andrew Maddox's jacket scrap had convinced many that the young man was no longer alive, though no body had been found. Mrs. Price Ridley spoke of nothing else at the post office, insisting that Lydia Gray had entangled the boy in some dreadful affair. At the Blue Boar, Ruby repeated for the 5th time her story of Andrew and the stranger, each telling slightly more elaborate than the last. Even the vicar, ordinarily devoted to gentler matters, admitted privately to Mrs. Clement that he feared the village was under the shadow of a very dark business indeed. Inspector Caldwell, however, had grown wary of easy conclusions. He told Sergeant Webb, "It is too tidy, Webb. Evidence falls into our laps at the very moment we most need it. Crates, letters, and scraps of cloth too neat for chance. We are being shown a play, not reality." The sergeant, eager but less certain, only nodded. Miss Marple, sitting that same morning in her little garden with her knitting needles flashing gently in the sun, had reached the same conclusion. She had long believed that the guilty party was not the one most loudly accused, but rather the one who had taken the greatest pains to direct attention elsewhere. And she had also learned through long experience that guilt revealed itself most surely under the quiet pressure of being watched without knowing it. Thus, she resolved upon a simple, homely test of the kind no policeman would think worthy, but which, to her mind, might bring the truth to light. It would involve honey, naturally, for honey had been at the center of the matter from the first. That afternoon, she set about her plan. She asked Owen Maddox, under the pretext of needing a jar for her household, if he might spare her a fresh one. The old beekeeper, grateful for her kindness and seeking any distraction from his grief, gladly obliged. She returned home with the jar, set it on her table, and then invited several key people for tea the following day. Lydia Gray, Ruby, and Mr. Hargreaves. She asked Owen as well, though she doubted he would come, for sorrow weighed heavily on him. The next day, the 4 did indeed arrive, each for different reasons. Ruby was curious, hoping for news. Hargreaves was eager to prove himself useful. Lydia came because refusal might seem like avoidance, and she was too proud for that. Owen came reluctantly, shoulders bowed, his cap in his hands, as though he felt every movement was a duty rather than a choice. Miss Marple welcomed them warmly, set them at her small table, and poured tea with the air of a hostess concerned only with comfort. She produced her usual seed cake, but alongside it she placed the jar of honey Owen had given her. She set it prominently upon the tray, the lid gleaming in the light. "How fortunate I am," she remarked cheerfully, "to have such good honey for my tea. So many things in this world taste better when sweetened." She turned the jar slightly so that each of her guests might see it. "Do help yourselves if you take honey." It was, on the surface, the most innocent of gestures. Yet Miss Marple's eyes, though lowered as she stirred her own cup, missed nothing. She saw Ruby lean forward eagerly, but not to take honey, only to remark how she had sold such jars at the fete. She saw Owen flinch slightly, as though reminded of his nephew's absence, and then look away. She saw Hargreaves adjust his spectacles and shake his head, saying he preferred sugar. But Lydia's reaction was different. Her gaze fixed on the jar too long, her lips tightened, and her hand trembled faintly as she reached for her teacup instead, deliberately avoiding the honey, though she ordinarily took it. Miss Marple said nothing. She allowed the conversation to wander, offering gentle encouragement to Ruby's stories and Hargreaves's pedantry. She mentioned, in passing, how curious it was that one of the jars from the recovered crate had been emptied so neatly. As though, she mused, something other than honey had been the object. Then she smiled faintly, her needles clicking. Of course, one mustn't be fanciful. The effect of her remark was subtle but telling. Owen muttered in dismay, shaking his head. Ruby's eyes brightened with speculation. Hargreaves laughed nervously, and Lydia's hand, so carefully steady, betrayed her again with the faintest quiver. She forced a smile and spoke quickly of something else, but Miss Marple saw the effort. The guilty seldom trembled at accusation. It was at the suggestion of what might be discovered next that fear betrayed them. After her guests departed, Inspector Caldwell called. Miss Marple described her little experiment in her mild, roundabout way. Caldwell listened, skeptical at first, but grew more thoughtful as she explained. "You see, Inspector," she said gently, "people do not fear what is ordinary. They fear what they know to be connected to their own actions." Mrs. Gray's eyes lingered on that jar because she recognized something of its importance. "She has more to tell than she has admitted." Caldwell frowned. "And you believe she's the culprit?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, Inspector, not the culprit, but entangled. She may have known something, perhaps even carried something once. Yet I do not believe she arranged these little discoveries for us. That belongs to someone else who profits by pointing suspicion her way." Caldwell considered this in silence. Then he admitted that a new piece of information had come to light. A car, matching Ruby's description of the one near the quarry road, had been seen again in Much Benham. The driver was a man known for shady dealings, a fellow by the name of Pritchard. Caldwell intended to bring him in for questioning, but, he added, "I'd wager, even if he's involved, he's not alone." Miss Marple agreed softly. No spider spins a web with only one thread. That night, the village braced itself for further revelations. Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlor, reflecting on her small test. She had confirmed that Lydia Gray's fear was genuine but not necessarily proof of her guilt. Rather, it suggested knowledge she was unwilling to share, perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of fear of someone else. And so the circle tightened further. The jars, the crate, the letters, and the torn jacket were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple sensed that the picture they formed was almost ready to emerge. The test had begun. Soon, the final move would come, when the guilty hand revealed itself not by what it did, but by how it reacted when the harmless old lady made one more gentle, seemingly innocent remark. Tuesday morning arrived with a hush over St. Mary Mead, the kind of quiet that comes when a village senses the climax of a long-whispered drama. The air was heavy, the bees in Owen Maddox's hives droning low as if they too felt the suspense. People paused at their gates, glanced toward the lane, and whispered of Inspector Caldwell's summons. Word had spread that the inspector meant to bring matters to a head at the vicarage that day. The villagers, hungry for answers, lingered about in hopeful proximity, pretending to admire flower beds or exchange greetings, but really waiting for the conclusion of the mystery that had gripped them all. Inside the vicarage, the air was thick with anticipation. Inspector Caldwell had gathered those most closely concerned. Owen Maddox, pale and drawn. Lydia Gray, upright and dignified, though her hands were clasped too tightly in her lap. Ruby, restless, eyes darting to every corner, Mr. Hargreaves, perspiring slightly in his ill-fitting suit, and, of course, Miss Marple, sitting quietly with her knitting in her lap, her blue eyes mild but alert. Sergeant Webb stood near the door, notebook ready. Caldwell began with calm authority. We have pursued this matter with care. We have searched the lanes, the quarry road, and the cottages. We have recovered a crate of honey jars, some opened, some missing. We have found letters, scraps of cloth, and hints of strangers. But today, I believe, we may put the pieces together. I've asked you here so that truth may be spoken plainly. A murmur ran around the room. Miss Marple glanced at Caldwell with faint amusement. He had the look of a man ready to cast his net, though she suspected he did not yet see all that it contained. It was not his fault the inspector was methodical and precise, but truth in human affairs was not always caught by precision. It was often revealed by behavior, by small betrayals of manner. And so she waited, knitting needles clicking softly, ready to speak when the moment came. Caldwell began with the stranger. We have traced the motor car described by Ruby. It belongs to a man named Pritchard, known for smuggling small valuables out of London. He has not been found yet, but his presence in Much Benham has been confirmed. This strongly suggests Andrew Maddox had contact with men of questionable trade. The honey jars, I believe, were used to conceal items for transport. Andrew, whether knowingly or not, became entangled in their scheme. Owen gave a groan of anguish. My Andrew in such company? No, Inspector, you must be wrong. But Caldwell pressed on. We must face facts, Mr. Maddox. The jars were tampered with. One was emptied, and your nephew vanished the very evening he was last seen with the stranger. Ruby leaned forward eagerly. Then it was him. That stranger he's to blame. Lydia Gray said nothing, her lips set in a thin line. Miss Marple observed her carefully, noting the rigid posture, the stillness that spoke more loudly than words. Lydia was not merely indifferent. She was guarding something. It was then that Miss Marple's soft voice broke the charged silence. I think, Inspector, if I may, that we must consider not only what was hidden, but also who wished us to find what we have found. Evidence has appeared at the most convenient moments. That is seldom the way with truth. Caldwell glanced at her. You believe someone has been planting clues? Oh, indeed, Miss Marple said mildly. Consider the crate discovered by a farmhand after days of fruitless searching. The letters scattered just where they might be found. The scrap of cloth caught in a thorn bush, as if waiting for the milk boy's eye. Each piece of evidence has guided us very firmly in one direction toward Mrs. Gray. All eyes turned to Lydia. She lifted her chin. I have denied it from the beginning. I did not lure Andrew nor harm him. Yes, I saw him with the stranger. That is all. And yet, Miss Marple continued gently, your manner at tea yesterday suggested otherwise. You feared the honey jar on my tray, though I had said nothing of its significance. You trembled when I spoke of secrets hidden within. That was not the reaction of a guilty hand, but of a woman who has been made to carry knowledge she cannot speak. You are afraid, Mrs. Gray, but not of us." The room was very still. Lydia's face paled, then flushed. She pressed her lips together, but her eyes shone with a sudden wetness. I cannot," Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice tender but firm. "You can, for silence will not protect you now. It will only protect the one who has arranged this play. It was Ruby who broke first." "She's hiding something," she said sharply. "She must be. Why else would she?" But Miss Marple's gaze turned calmly toward Ruby. "And why, my dear, were you so eager to describe the stranger at the Blue Boar? So quick to embroider your tale each time it was asked? Why did you recall in such detail the tapping of the jar?" Ruby blinked, startled. "Because it happened. Because you saw what you wished us to see," Miss Marple said softly. "Or rather, you told us what you wished us to believe. The tapping, the stranger, and the car. The stranger may exist, yes, but it was you who fixed him in our minds as Andrew's last companion. You who guided suspicion away from yourself, and you who had the easiest access to those honey jars." The inspector looked sharply at Ruby. "Are you accusing her, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I'm only observing." Ruby handled the jars at the Blue Boar. She spoke often with Andrew, more than she admitted. She knew of the crate, and she knew how to plant a scrap of cloth and how to drop a letter. People underestimate a barmaid's resourcefulness, Inspector. But I have found barmaids in my time to be very observant and very clever when it suits them. Ruby's face had gone pale. "You think that I had anything to do with Andrew's vanishing?" Miss Marple's needles clicked once more, her hands unshaken. "Yes, my dear. Because you betrayed yourself at tea yesterday, just as surely as Mrs. Gray did. When I set the honey jar upon the table, you leaned forward eagerly, not to taste it, but to remark upon it, to remind us of your story. A guilty person, you see, cannot resist repeating the tale that shields them, but the innocent have no need." Ruby sprang to her feet, her eyes flashing. "That's nonsense. Anyone might plant a crate in a ditch," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Scatter letters in the hedgerow, tear a strip of cloth from a jacket and place it where a boy would find it." "Oh, Ruby, you were clever, but not clever enough. You thought no one would notice the neatness of your discoveries. But I noticed, and Andrew noticed too. That is why he quarreled with you at the Blue Boar. He realized you were using his uncle's honey for purposes that had nothing to do with sweetness." A gasp went round the room. Owen Maddox groaned again, clutching his cap. "Then where is he? Where is my Andrew?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Alive, I hope, though frightened." Ruby persuaded him to carry a crate to the churchyard. He thought it was harmless until he saw what was hidden inside. When he resisted, Ruby panicked. She arranged his disappearance to look like the work of a stranger, but Andrew, I believe, is still near. He is too valuable to kill outright. He knows too much. Ruby trembled, her bravado faltering. "You've no proof," she whispered. "No proof, perhaps," Miss Marple said. "But proof will come. You will betray yourself again, just as you did yesterday. The guilty always do." Caldwell stepped forward, his face stern. "That will be quite enough, Miss Ruby. You'll come with us. We'll see how your story holds under proper questioning." Ruby's eyes darted wildly, then fell to the ground. She said nothing. The room seemed to exhale as the tension broke, though Owen Maddox's face remained stricken. Miss Marple set aside her knitting. "It has not ended yet, Inspector. There are still the missing jars and Andrew himself. But the play has reached its turning point. We have seen the actor who arranged the ITG scenes. Now, we must find the boy who was forced into them, and with that, the old lady sat back, serene once more, while the village of St. Mary Mead braced for the final act of the drama that had so disturbed its peace. News of Ruby's arrest passed through St. Mary Mead with the quiet speed of rain moving across a field. Curtains fluttered, doors opened an inch, and the village inhaled as one. Yet the air did not lighten, for a single question remained suspended over fences and tea tables alike. Where was Andrew Maddox? Inspector Caldwell understood that question must be answered before the village could settle. He also understood, now more than ever, that the proper route to the answer was neither speed nor thunder. After an hour at the station, Ruby had given very little in the way of confession. She cried, protested, and grew indignant by turns. She named Pritchard only when pressed, then tried to withdraw the name as though words could be gathered back like thread. She insisted she had not hurt Andrew. "I liked him," she said, in a tone that implied liking justified a multitude of schemes. But her tale wavered on the matter of where he had gone after the fete. Late that afternoon, Caldwell walked Miss Marple as far as the churchyard gate. "She is stubborn," he said, with a weary patience. "But there is a crack. She admits to passing packages to Pritchard's people. She admits to steering questions toward the stranger. She will not admit to planting evidence, of course." "They rarely do," Miss Marple said mildly. "It sounds to them more criminal than the crime. And yet, Inspector, we must not let Ruby's dramaturgy distract us. Think how very useful to her it would be if we spent our energy chasing Pritchard up and down the quarry road while the one thing that matters remained very close at hand." "The one thing?" "The boy," Miss Marple said softly. "If Ruby thinks herself clever, she will assume she can still manage him. She will suppose, perhaps, that she knows where he is or where the last of the jars has been hidden. If we kindle the right little fire, she will go to warm her hands." Caldwell stopped, brow furrowing. "You mean to set bait?" "A little honey for a wasp," Miss Marple said, and allowed herself a prim smile at the mixed metaphor. "You will not mind, I think, if Mrs. Clement begins to mention, most innocently, that a jar with a peculiarly nicked lid has been found among the Altar Guild's stores. That it bears, so the story goes, a tiny scratch beneath the Roman accident of tightening, which would make it easy, even in the dark, to recognize." Caldwell's mouth twitched. "There is no such jar." "Oh, but we have had so many jars," Miss Marple returned. "It would be the easiest thing in the world for a person in a hurry to believe she has simply overlooked one, and once she has believed, she cannot help herself." By evensong, the word had taken on its own momentum. The Altar Guild, who knew nothing of it, would have been startled to learn of the special jar they were said to have discovered. The whisper ran through the Blue Boar's low room and out again on two separate tongues before Ruby, in the station house, heard it herself when a constable with all the discretion of a man who likes to be thought informed muttered the tidbit to another. She kept her eyes down, but Miss Marple had been right. Ruby could not resist. Every now and then she asked to use the necessary. Every time she did, her manner was brisker, her pulse quicker. Caldwell, who had learned by now to watch hands, saw how her fingers tapped the tabletop with a rhythm that was not patience. Near 9, a message reached Caldwell from Sergeant Webb, positioned near the lich gate at Miss Marple's suggestion. A shadow had slipped along the hedge, paused by the vestry door, then moved away toward the footpath for the cricket field. Webb did not stop the figure. He followed at a quiet distance. Caldwell, already shrugging into his coat, met Miss Marple at the gate of her cottage. "Not the church, then," Miss Marple said, satisfied. "No one steals from a place they do not trust. She will go where she herself puts what she fears we might find." The footpath lay pale in the late light. A bird turned over in a hedge and settled again, as if deciding the disturbance was not worth its attention. They reached the edge of the cricket field and the stand of old trees where Tommy Briggs had once claimed to see Andrew hide a tin. Webb, from the shadow of the pavilion, lifted a hand and pointed. A figure knelt by the largest beech, back turned, hands disappearing into the hollow bowl. "Ruby," Caldwell murmured. But when he stepped forward and the figure started up, it was not Ruby. It was a man in a dark cap, hard-faced, with a narrow jaw and a look that wanted to make the whole world move out of his way. Pritchard. He bolted left, and Webb blocked him. Caldwell's arm went out with a quiet efficiency born of practice, and in moments, Pritchard's wrists were secure in iron. "What were you after?" Caldwell asked. Pritchard said something ungracious about minding one's business. Caldwell nodded at Webb, who reached into the hollow and drew out 3 shapes sticky with dried sugar jars, their red lids dulled, their labels smeared. One sloshed faintly. Caldwell unscrewed it and lifted out, with 2 careful fingers, a packet wrapped in oiled silk. Inside lay a flat stack of slip-bearer bonds, some from London banks, the sort that travel swiftly because they belong to whoever holds them. Another jar held a narrow roll of films, 2 inches across. The third, a woman's oval brooch of pearls and enamel, old and valuable, which explained the acrid tang. Miss Marple had once noticed camphor rubbed into the felt to keep damp away. "Convenient things, jars," Miss Marple observed, "but they do not climb into trees by themselves." For all that, Pritchard had not come for Andrew. On that point he was sullen, then indignant, then exploitative. He would trade information for leniency. Caldwell left him to the sergeant, who had a talent for allowing silence to lengthen until men spoke to cut it. Miss Marple's face had grown still. "It is one thing to find the goods," she said. "It is quite another to find the boy." They found Andrew at dawn, which is the hour truth often prefers. The search had widened again through the night, not noisily, but with that steady industry Caldwell liked in a man, and Miss Marple liked in a village. It was Owen who saw it first, or rather, smelled it in the cool air smoke where there should not be smoke, near the old bottling shed behind the abandoned cider house, 1/2 a mile on the quarry road. He ran, heart hammering in a chest that had forgotten such effort, and Caldwell, Webb, and Miss Marple were not far behind. The shed's padlock hung broken. Inside, the air was sour with damp wood and a little sweet with spilled syrup. On the floor, beneath an old sacking, lay Andrew Maddox, dirty, hollow-eyed, and blinking as those born to the sun blink when brought out of shadow. Owen was there before the policeman, on his knees, hands shaking as he lifted the boy with all the gentleness he had given his hives. "I told them I wouldn't," Andrew rasped, voice raw. "I told them they could keep their cursed packets. They said they'd make it look right that I'd run off with a woman and money Lydia. Oh, God, Lydia, hush," Miss Marple said, laying a hand, light as moth wing, on his sleeve. "No one in their right mind thinks you ran off with anyone. Drink this." She held a tin mug while Webb, practical as ever, fetched water from the butt outside. In the station later, a simpler story emerged, as simple as such things can be. Ruby had been the village hinge for men like Pritchard who require such hinges. Someone at ease among strangers. Someone who hears everything and is believed when she chooses to speak. She had learned the convenience of honest jars and an honest beekeeper. Andrew had served as a carrier once without knowing. The second time he knew. He had lifted out a packet by the church lane, and the sticky corner had left its signature on the wall. He had argued with Ruby on Friday and with Pritchard on Sunday. For refusing, he had earned a blow that tore his sleeve, and then a locked door and promises that he would be freed when the last jars were collected, and the village had been pointed in a direction that did not include Pritchard. Ruby had planted the cloth, scattered the letters she herself had written in a neat, pretty hand, and talked of a stranger until even the truest things about the stranger sounded like some of her embroidery. Lydia Gray's small part lay in fear and pride, not malice. Pritchard had used her once months ago in town, when her need was great and his offer looked like help. She had met Andrew upon evening walks because he looked intelligent and kind, and she wished this, she said with a flattening voice, to warn him away from those who came with city polish. Her silence at the start had been the silence of a woman who has seen how quickly a village makes a story fit the shape it prefers. Her tremor at Miss Marple's tea had been not guilt, but recognition that jars could hold more than sweetness. By noon, the village possessed, as villages do, a complete history of the case, in which each teller naturally enjoyed the role of having suspected the right person at the right time. Mrs. Price Ridley forgave the generality without naming herself among the unjust. Mr. Hargreaves discovered, in retrospect, that he had always mistrusted Ruby's exact coinage. Tommy Briggs was a hero in his own mind, for he had once pointed at a tree. The vicar thanked Providence. Mrs. Clement thanked Inspector Caldwell. Inspector Caldwell thanked Miss Marple with a look that acknowledged both help and the difficulty of saying so aloud in a world of men who prefer to be thought sufficient. That evening, Owen and Andrew sat together in the beekeeper's cottage. The kettle steamed, and the room smelled of wax and polish, as though order itself had a fragrance. Andrew's face, scrubbed and pale, turned to the window where the light went blue over the hives. "I don't deserve your kindness, Uncle," he said. "I meant to leave you for the city again. I kept it from you because I thought it was kinder." Owen studied his hands and then his nephew. "We will keep bees this summer," he said. "In the winter you may go or stay as you please. Kindness is not a thing you throw at a man's head, Andrew. It is a thing you lay down for him to pick up." Miss Marple called late with a seed cake that Florence insisted on cutting too thick. She sat, taking no credit and asking a few questions, and when Andrew tried to thank her, she forestalled him with the smallest of smiles. "It was your doing, really," she said. "You put the jars where they could be found by those who needed to find them, by wicked men and by policemen both. There is a way," she added gently, "in which even the foolish act becomes wise when it is turned into a good account." When she walked home, the evening was soft as muslin. St. Mary Mead had resumed its proper sounds: spoons on plates, a dog's distant bark, and a gate's tired hinge. Bees worried the last of the clover as if nothing in the world had mattered in the interim. And yet, as Miss Marple reached her little garden, she paused to look back at the village. It had altered, as villages do when truth has been through them, not in its hedges or roofs, but in the ways people glanced and looked away. Florence met her at the door with the news that the inspector had sent his compliments and an ordinary Geranthis thyme, quite safe to replace the bait the village had never owned. Miss Marple laughed softly and set it on her shelf. "Human nature," she murmured, "is much like honey. Sweet, certainly, but so capable of holding what we put into it. One must take care of what one hides and what one tastes." She lit her lamp and took up her knitting content. The case of the beekeeper's nephew had ended as such cases end, when decency and patience are allowed their work with handcuffs for the violent, leniency where fear had been the sin, and a village returned to its slow, complicated peace. If there was sorrow in it, it was only the old sorrow. Miss Marple knew so well that people, unlike bees, will often follow the wrong queen. But she sat, and the lamp burned steady, and outside, in the gathering dark, the hives hummed with the sound of order reasserting itself.